co-founder of RevOps Co-op. We have a global community of 17,000 plus operators from all over the globe. We do a variety of things from digital events like this to in-person events. We have courses and education available on our website, a lot of different membership types as well, including a free version. I also have Chara, who is the co-founder of RevenueHero, and I have Patrick Spychalski, who is the co-founder over at The Kiln. And so, guys, welcome. Thank you for joining. I really appreciate it. Before we dive into the slides and I officially pass things over to Chara to kind of get us kicked off, I want you guys to add anything to the professional introduction that you would like. And then I have one non-work related question for you both as well to pepper in there. So Chara, I'm going to start with you since Patrick is technically our guest here. So he's going to have a little bit of time to think about what his answer is. But one, tell us more about yourself personally, professionally. And then my non-work related question is, I want to know what is like, if I looked at your recently played songs on like Apple Music or Spotify or whatever, what would be like the most embarrassing thing that I would find on there like, that you've listened to? So that's my question for you. Go ahead and answer that and then add anything to that professional introduction.
Yeah. So the most embarrassing thing would be that I went into a diss track loop recently and got into a rabbit hole on YouTube, started watching Eminem diss tracks, the history behind it. And I've been playing an Eminem diss track playlists on loop for I think a good 2-3 hours.
Nice.
I think guilty of that. Yeah. So professionally, I'm a product manager turned sales engineer turned today I run RevenueHero, I'm one of the co-founders. So I used to oversee marketing as a function. And I always say this, when you go from product to marketing, you owe a lot of people a lot of apologies because whatever you thought was, hey, that's so easy, why does it take so long? You realize why it's so hard. And then now I've made the transformation from running marketing at RevenueHero to understanding ops a lot more because we're rebuilding, the marketing org at RevenueHero to where we want it to be in the future. And that involves a ton of ops work, cleaning things up, getting things running, making sure that, the things that seem so easy and you just expect out of the box in all your systems are actually in place. So I'm going through the rigmarole of all of that. And now I get the, pain of ops. And after having put in several hundred hours, that's my professional journey so far.
Yeah, I love it. All right, Patrick, you're next, my friend. What's the most embarrassing thing on your recently played track list? And then add anything to that professional introduction.
Yeah, totally. While Shara was doing his intro, I feel like the only thing I can think of is I've listened to a lot of Bad Bunny recently. He's actually a great artist. That's not embarrassing in itself. I just don't know any Spanish, and all of his songs are in Spanish. So I feel like I'm kind of a poser listening to them. When you like music, you're naturally trying to learn the words of a given song. For me, it's almost like learning gibberish because I don't understand what the actual words behind the music are. But he's still a great artist. I highly recommend listening to him. Professionally, co-founder of The Kiln, we're an agency that builds go-to-market systems for businesses. We work with a lot of fast-growing AI startups all the way up to mid-market enterprise companies and building systems with AI that actually add value for businesses. So yeah, that's a high level on me.
Yeah, I love it. I think I can't let you guys talk about embarrassing songs without sharing my own. I have a spot for Miley Cyrus, always on my playlist. I don't know if it's Party in the USA or any of the other bangers that she has, but those, for whatever reason, remain on my track list. But hey, also great artist.
She's a hit maker. There's nothing to be ashamed about there. I mean, she's got bangers.
Yeah. Thank you guys very much for joining. And last reminder for everybody, as we go through this, drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A. We're going to take them as we go. Char, I'm going to turn it over to you to pull up your slides and get us started on the content part of this. As we do this, I'm going to launch a poll for everyone asking about what their biggest blocker is in using AI for go-to-market today. We're just curious to see where people are at, some of the things that might be getting in the way, and how this compares to what our own panelists think. So I'm going to leave this open for another minute or so, and then I'll close it and share the results. But while we let people fill this out, Chara, why don't you kind of get us started on the content here?
Yeah, of course. And I think blockers is a great way to start the AI conversation because after you look at LinkedIn and all the conversation around what folks are accomplishing with AI, or at least claiming to, I've noticed that this has been my experience, or at least was my experience when I first started experimenting with AI. Because from the outside in, it feels like everybody's cracked something magical with LLMs, ChatGPT, Claude, OpenAI, what have you. And then when you try to implement something that's actually useful in production for your sales team, for your marketing org, it immediately feels like you're doing something wrong. And I think that's a good crux of the overall piece that we're discussing here, right? Because the foundation for AI, and as has always been for ML in its previous form, is garbage in, garbage out, right? And what really gets underestimated in building go-to-market AI systems is the effort that goes prior to actually launching something that's useful, which is mostly a lot of ops work, a lot of cleanups, a lot of standardization, and just a lot of the unsexy work that doesn't get spoken about in most of these posts, right? All you see is, hey, I now automate 200,000 emails, right? And get 50% opens and so much conversions. What you don't see is how long it took to actually automate that, how many people, how many man hours or person hours, and the actual effort involved. Because that's not the fun part to talk about, but that's what we're here to discuss. The not so fun hard parts, which to me is actually the fun part to solve for, right?
And it looks like I just shared the poll results, but it looks like most people said biggest blockers are around incomplete CRM data and then lack of real-time context as well.
Yeah, and that reflects what we've observed in our own settings. So, which gives us a good segue to get into what AI surfaces really, really well, or what experimenting with AI surfaces really well in an organization, right? So, like you said, getting CRMs up to date is still a struggle. And if that's the case, and that's going to be the source of truth for your go-to-market experiments, what's really, really important is that you clean that up first, because without that foundation, none of your experiments are going to be useful for anybody in your organization, right? Because when you say go-to-market infrastructure, at least today, it's still your HubSpot, it's your Salesforce, it's a marketing automation system that feeds into your CRM. And this is what most folks rely on as their source of intelligence about their contacts, about the companies, and most of their conversations with, that's the go-to-market brain, right? So when it comes to experiments with AI, the most fundamental understanding that we've gained in doing this for the last few months is that you fundamentally go from this, which is your CRM, where data is structured as objects, which have relationships to other objects, mostly optimized for simple workflows, to this, which is prompts, right? Which is more natural language, where you're actually replacing the intuition and the ability for a human being to put together information that's typically stored in multiple different screens and objects. You bring all of that together in a coherent manner and then send it across to an LLM for it to give you a meaningful response, right? Which means if your CRM data isn't, squeaky clean, or at least parts of your CRM doesn't have all the context, you're just going to be sending gibberish to your LLMs and to your AI models and getting gibberish back, right? So I'm sure, Patrick, you've been through enough CRM nightmares dealing with clay and expectations being through the roof, but just foundations being shaky, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of points that I think are important to touch on revolving around this topic. The first slide that you went through, touching on expectation versus reality and what that looks like. I've noticed that almost all of our clients, when they first become prospects and we first initially have those introduction conversations to work with them, they're super fired up about the AI systems that they have in mind. And that's great. But oftentimes it's somewhat dangerous because, of course, to your point, there's a lot of underlying work involved in building these systems that might be unexpected. It's not just like kind of a magic button you build and it immediately works. And so you can almost think of it as a curve where, like, let's say the y-axis is like excitement level and the x-axis is time. Like immediately in the beginning, they're at like a super high level of excitement. And then our goal by the time we close them is actually to have their excitement slightly lower, because they have to be like fully understanding of the idea that their CRM is really messy. We need to fix that first. There's adoption problems that they need to face. And so like it's actually a far more complicated and difficult discussion than just like, let's press a button and turn a workflow on. And then once you go forward with the engagement process, ideally you have this very low level of excitement that slowly builds up over time because you're seeing this thing you're building actually start to work and realize that there is value despite the amount of upfront work. And then ideally you kind of get back to that initial level of excitement once adoption is created. So to your point, the crux of all of these workflows is usually CRM data or structured data in some capacity that is not presently working or structured enough to be using in a workflow. And almost every single time we work with a client, unless they have a dedicated RevOps firm in-house already, there's usually problems with their CRM's data being accurate or structured or not formatted properly or unnormalized, or maybe they don't have the proper objects created for a given thing. So there's always a lot of upfront work in that regard. And I totally agree. You need to translate that data into something that's so good you can action upon it with an AI prompt.
Yeah, 100%. So once and that's the fundamentals that, typically tends to get skipped when people speak about results. But unless you go through, making sure that your CRM is up to date, you keep enriching information to keep it up to date, and are finally able to create those phrases or those prompts which start making sense, you won't be able to get to this, right? Pretty much a go-to-market co-pilot system, which takes all of that data from your CRM, which is converted into meaningful prompts to then give your go-to-market teams, whether those are SDRs, whether those are marketers, outcomes that they can actually, or other output that they can actually use on day-to-day conversations to plan out, let's say, how to run a cold call, how to run an email without actually having to put in the hours that go into doing the research manually, pulling in company research, contact research, and then putting it all together to form a really meaningful and useful email or cold call, right? So the journey from, like Patrick mentioned, getting hyped up about AI experiments through to keeping that hype consistent throughout the cleanup process to finally getting to prompt readiness and then seeing the experiment actually show results is actually the hard part. And we'll go through what it actually takes to start from hype and messy data all the way through to useful outcomes, right? So I wasn't able to get the actual ultra hard version of the Mario game, but it's very similar to that experience, right? So I think the first hurdle that you need to get past is getting buy-in from either the execs or your leadership team that it is worth going through the process of cleaning up your data, getting it prompt ready, and then feeding it into LLMs, because you most likely have a mandate of, hey, let's get AI ready within end of the month or within a couple of weeks or something ridiculous like that. So you probably have buy-in, but the expectations that come with the buy-in are usually ridiculous, which is why it's really, really important to both educate them and prepare yourselves for all the hurdles you're going to have to go past, right? You have missing CRM properties, you have outdated collateral that's stored in multiple different sources, you have duplicate records in your CRM. And this is the typical process that you're going to have to go through, and varies from company size to company size. But us being a 27 member, early stage startup, we ourselves had to go through like cleaning up 70,000 company records and then getting all the records for companies that we did want to target clean, and so many missing data points like job titles, LinkedIn URLs, phone numbers, what have you. So this is the typical journey that we see when anybody starts out with an AI experiment that's worth its salt, right? And so the first step that you usually go through in any AI experiment is auditing and enriching your CRM data, right? So when I say audit, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, speaking to a bunch of ops folks, but it depends on the state that your CRM is in, how messy it is, how many contacts you have, etc. But what we've seen work really well is if you start out auditing your entire CRM for the sake of the AI experiment, you're never going to start. And like Patrick mentioned, the hype is probably going to die down way before you're able to actually show anything of value. So we typically recommend focusing on a very small subset of the data that you already have in your CRM to start with your cleanup process, with your audit, and get all the data points that you need filled in for that small data set before you get to the next step, right? Involved in updating the data points, enriching it, and anything else, right? So I'm sure Patrick has a lot of insights on running these audits or using Clay to ease these processes. So Patrick, anything you wanted to add in step one?
Yeah, so firstly, I would recommend anybody who's having CRM cleanliness issues to go check out Clay's university kind of course on this. After this little rant, I will send a link to that course in the chat. But the reason that I think it's so important to watch is because I think everyone kind of struggles with CRM cleanliness problems. It's like pretty much across the board, one of the major issues in building out actually good go-to-market systems. And Clay can do a really great job of both validating data in your CRM as well as enriching, augmenting, normalizing, and eventually like improving the data in your CRM. And so a lot of the things we do with clients at the beginning of engagements, and we make sure to do this before any other work actually, is validating whether this data in their CRM is up to date and clean and accurate. And almost certainly it isn't. And that just happens because, as you can imagine, you have dozens of sales team members updating different fields with different information. Maybe it was updated a year or 2 years ago. So using Clay to validate this information with up-to-date data is super helpful. The second thing after we validate it is usually try to structure, normalize, and enrich it for all the additional data you're looking to find, and then uploading it. And this is not a workflow you have to hire an agency like us for at all. It's actually quite simple in theory, which is why I plan to send you this link, and I highly recommend watching it, because it's literally 1 to 2 Clay tables can entirely clean your CRM if built properly. A lot of the functions that you need in order to do this aren't rocket science by any means. It's my opinion, the best Clay use case that exists today. So again, highly recommend obviously running and auditing your CRM, but then building a system that can continuously enrich it over time instead of just like one big clean, which is what people generally try to do.
And I have a question, Char, for you, and Patrick, for you as well. So Char, if you can go back to that go-to-market Copilot slide that you had. So this is, well, one, I guess first, I'm sharing the results from the poll where we just asked people about their confidence in the completeness of their CRM data. We have 2 unicorns. I don't know, Patrick, if you and Char were able to answer this question, and you are the 2 responses that had said you're very confident and your data, your CRM data is clean and enriched, but most people are in the somewhat confident to not confident at all camp when it comes to this particular topic. So folks kind of know this go-to-market Copilot that you're looking at on the screen. This is something that Char and his team built for their like SDR and sales team at RevenueHero. It's powered by Clay and Lovable and some other stuff. And he's going to kind of give us a tour and kind of walk through how we approach this. But Char, my question for you, and then Patrick, for you when you're dealing with some of your clients. So that's the output, right? That's the end result. And Patrick, you mentioned a lot of your clients might come to you with like an AI tool or product in mind. And so my question, and Char, I'll start with you first, is like, where did you start? So like, obviously I'm guessing like you had a problem that you were trying to solve for, right? And this is ultimately the solution that you decided to employ. But what was the beginning? And I'll ask you to answer that question first as it relates to this. And then Patrick, once he's done, I'll be curious from your perspective, how do you get at that with your clients, especially if prospects are coming to you and they're like, hey, I really want to use tool XYZ. It's like, well, that's a product, a solution to a problem. Let's figure out how to get at the problem. So Char, I'll ask you that question first.
Yeah, the go-to-market Copilot example that I'm showing is steered towards SDRs. What I was observing was that the amount of our SDR team was spending, and this is the pain that a lot of products out there are trying to solve as well. The amount of time folks are spending on just trying to figure out what's relevant to this persona who just signed up for the product, or I'm trying to prospect. What are the most important things about this company that I need to know about? The amount of time that they were spending on that just seemed ridiculous. And the answer just always seemed to be keep hiring, hire more folks, hire more folks. And just as a founder, it felt like it's 2025. Everybody's saying that, they're creating unicorns and magic out of thin air using AI and whatnot. And I was like, there just needs to be a better way to solve this internally without selling out for one more tool in my stack where I don't control the feature requests, I don't control the quality of the product. So that was one of the pain points. The other one was we like to keep our marketing org lean, right? Because we just like to move fast on experiments and try to get as much output as possible. And when we were going through the thought process of, hey, how do we scale this marketing org without having to hire too many folks at this stage? The answer again was, hey, so when it comes to marketing roadmaps, you're mostly looking at processing vast amount of customer insights and data in the form of call transcripts, emails, website analytics, what have you, to then distill that into, hey, what do our prospects care about? What should I write about? What should I host webinars on? What are the top misconceptions about my product? And none of these seem like problems that could only be solved by an army of folks. And that was the inception for, experimenting with AI, LLMs, global, and what have you.
Yeah. And Patrick, how do you, like, when you are talking to prospects and folks that are looking to leverage AI and technology, how do you get them to the point where you start with, like, what problems are you looking to solve?
Yeah, so I think a lot of sales calls we get on, and this actually isn't a bad thing per se, but a lot of prospects just find a tool on LinkedIn and they're like, oh, this is a really cool tool, I want to use it. And then they come to an agency like ours to implement it, instead of thinking, I have this real problem I'm currently experiencing, let me go seek out a tool to solve it, which I think is actually the preferred way to go about it, but generally isn't the case. So if a client comes to us with a specific tool they want to use, we'll first just generally ask ourselves, will this tool solve a real problem for you and add value? But I think you have to really audit the tool's capabilities in order to do that. Like, for example, if you were running an outreach motion and you decided, like, I want to go use SalesLoft for this, can we implement SalesLoft? Well, I think it's worth considering, how are your SDRs functioning day to day and engaging with prospects? If you're building an AI system that generates copy, can we send that copy to SalesLoft? What is their API capability in doing that? So I think you actually have to do a deep dive on each tool and whether it can actually solve a problem truly. And then it's also worth considering, is the problem that you're currently facing, like, for lack of a better term, a real one? I live in New York City most of the time and I'm constantly going car shopping. And I'm like, I don't need a car. Like, I just want a car. It doesn't actually solve a problem for me. I just want the ability to drive around. Right. So it's kind of the same thing with tech.
Yeah.
I've noticed. So figuring out whether it's actually going to add value and solve a real problem and whether that tool is the right fit for it is usually the main thing we think through. But it requires more thought than just buying a piece of tech and hoping it works out.
Yeah. And so, Char, I'll let you get to kind of step 2 on the data hygiene piece. And then as we do this, Patrick, I'll ask you this question from Brianne, who is asking about criteria that you would use to evaluate an enrichment tool, something like Clay, versus the enrichment capabilities that may exist within a CRM, like Breeze within HubSpot, for example. What are the things that people should consider there?
The only thing you should need to consider really is the nuance and depth of data you're looking for. So if you're looking for basic firmographics, like company size, website, industry, HubSpot should be more than enough to figure that out. They have pretty accurate enrichment providers for those basic firmographics. If you're looking for more nuance or depth to the data you want to find, like, I want to find all these companies' 10Ks and financial filings and then make assumptions on those filings, or even things like accurate funding data, just any sort of niche data that HubSpot or any other CRM can't find, I would go look for Clay. The only other thing that's worth noting about the advantages of Clay is that HubSpot usually uses 1, maybe 2 data providers per data point when running enrichments internally. And Clay waterfalls usually like 5 to 7 for all the major data points. So the accuracy is generally much higher than that of what HubSpot will provide you. So in short, it just really matters, like, how much does this enrichment How significant is this enrichment to you? Like, are you going to be using this data for everything? Do you just care about like how big the company is? So that's usually the heuristic I would use.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add
Yeah.
is actually the cost side too. Like I know I looked at like doing some like enrichment through Breeze within our own HubSpot instance, and I just found it to be way more cost effective to do things through a clay table because it was, like I said, it was more cost effective and it gave me all the added flexibility, Patrick, that you just mentioned. But Char, I'll turn it over to you to get us going on step 2 here.
Yeah, one of the things I'd add to that conversation, which is very relevant to step 2, is keeping data updated. What I've seen in my own company at this size is that things move so fast that your CRM, even though enriched information, tends to get outdated real quick. I think products like Clay.ai, those kind of products are really good, not just at getting you the data, but also keeping things up to date. So I think the data update pipeline is also something that gets overseen quite often because, like most companies, you probably have a massive close lost or nurture bucket of companies. And I think today more than ever, it's possible to reach out to each one of them with hyper personalized messaging at the right time and to the right person. And for that, you need your data update pipelines in place, right? For instance, for a nurture sequence or for a nurture deal, you probably had a bunch of contacts who signed up way back then when they were in active evaluation. And by the time the nurture sequences start hitting the mailbox, we've seen so many cases where the person's changed jobs and are either not part of the same company anymore, or there's a new decision maker who's in the company who hasn't yet been picked up by HubSpot or Salesforce because nobody came to your website again, submitted the form, signed up for a webinar or any of your sources, right? But with products like Clay, with products like Firecrawl, which is for a different purpose, right? Which is to scrape website data, monitor positioning changes, copy on the website, and so on. What you get to do is keep that data updated in your CRM. So, while, like Patrick said, you definitely can rely on your CRM's native enrichment, through Breeze powered by Clearbit. But where you might need these other providers is to keep that data updated, to do a little bit of cleanup wherever necessary, and also for external signals which aren't necessarily monitored for by HubSpot, right? Like your hiring job openings, which might be really powerful signals for your go-to-market org to use, right? So I think one of the things I would add to the update pipeline is seems really, really simple, but when we started building this out, we relied on Clay, we relied on HubSpot, OpenAPI, Anthropic, Firecrawl, so many different products. When we tried to bring all of it together to one database, the most important decision that we had to take was, hey, which unique identifier do I use to marry all of this information together to then be able to access it meaningfully down the line, whether that is to string together a prompt, to send over to an LLM, or just to refer to, hey, does this company have this information, or does this contact's company have this information, and do I have it in a database? We decided to use the HubSpot company ID as the unique identifier universally across all our systems. And that worked out for us because we just roll everything up under it. But we've seen different approaches work out for different people. For instance, I know that Clay has a database ID that a lot of people use as the unique identifier that they send across to different systems. I think small decisions like these early on in your go-to-market infrastructure for your AI experiments really, really matter. And I saw a question about what happens if a company switches CRMs midway. So the way you'll go through this journey is that when you first start, nothing is real time because you're probably trying to experiment off of existing data. So even if your CRM switch happens midway, the way you start off with this experiment is to first run updates in bulk with the data that you have to validate your experiment, to then do real-time updates to your data through these different sources, right? So a good old CSV dump or a specific set of accounts from any data source, I would say is a good starting point. So a CRM switch needn't necessarily matter for your hypothesis stage. So you can just download the CSV of accounts that you're trying to work with, upload it to a product like Clay, get it completely enriched with all the information that's relevant for your go-to-market motion, whatever properties you need for your contacts, companies, what have you, which you can then choose to send back to the CRM that you chose to migrate to, and then start doing the real-time updates that work with that CRM, right? So when you're doing all of this, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is start with bulk. When you're doing bulk, when you're starting with existing data, rely on APIs. Once you have a decent data set, then you're ready to implement webhooks or to start listening to webhooks from different systems, because you now have stable data set to keep enriching. But when you start off, you're probably better off relying on APIs than webhooks, because by the time you get enough webhooks to enrich all the data, it's probably way too long, which is why you also need to choose products that have full-fledged APIs, really detailed API documentation, etc., which automatically becomes one of the criteria for evaluation, right? So Patrick, did you have anything to add to the data hygiene part before we move on? Awesome. So once you've established the data hygiene, so we covered the contacts, companies, enrichment part of the conversation, which is where you ensure that the data that you have is up to date, right? Which is, who your contacts are, which companies they're part of, how big the company is, the headquarter, what competing products they use, and everything that's relevant for your go-to-market motion, right? But I think one of the things that gets underestimated and even ignored in a lot of these AI experiments is so for all the Windows fans out there, I think the last known good configuration has saved my PC more times than I can count. So it's always reliable. I always fall back on it when I mess things up. So I think it's really, really important to maintain what I refer to as a last known good content repository. When I say content, I don't mean the all sprawling blog content repository that a company probably maintains. What I mean is the things that are important for your go-to-market motion, right? Which is product knowledge. How should features be described across your team, whether it's an SDR or an AE or a customer success manager, account manager, or a product marketer? You need to maintain an up-to-date, reliable product knowledge repository. Same goes for competitive insights, customer evidence in the form of case studies, testimonials, notes from reference calls. And what you'll realize when you're trying to gather all of these is you start appreciating your SDRs and your sales teams more, because you realize how many different sources these things typically exist in and how many different formats they're in, right? You have PDFs, you have videos, you have images, you have just a random YouTube link that somebody shared somewhere saying, hey, this is a video about a competitor. So when you're building out this go-to-market infrastructure, this is the next hard part that you'll have to deal with, where you bring together all of that information. And so what we've understood in doing this is that text is your best friend. So whether you have images, whether you have videos, whatever type of content you have, try to convert that content into text. So for videos, you can upload it into Descript to auto-generate the transcript, and then use that transcript in all the knowledge that you're going to use as a reference in your AI experiments. Images, I think most LLM models can consume and provide a pretty decent response. So as long as you're able to convert all your content in these categories into PDFs or documents, you're good. CSVs aren't globally parsable by all the LLM models yet, or at least not well enough to provide meaningful results. So you need to go through all the content pieces that's relevant to your go-to-market motion, converting into text and centralizing it in a repository which is easily accessible. And I'll get into which storage method works best and how we've approached it. Patrick, did you have anything to add to that before we move on?
I think it's like ridiculously important for this repository to exist. I think in many of the cases, especially when we're doing something like creating AI generated content for emails, having a place where you know the data is recent and up to date is pretty much the difference between a good and a bad outbound message. And this carries over to a lot of different use cases we have as well. So other than that, totally agree.
Yeah, fair enough. So, like I said, when you start thinking about how to store this content, it tends to get really overwhelming because if you actually think about all the tooling that you have at your disposal, I've not found one that's optimized to store all these types of content in one place. So you have Google Drives, you have your Dropboxes, and all the sales enablement products out there, which is supposed to be good at all of this. But what you'll quickly realize is that they're all good at storing this content. But when it comes to programmatically accessing all of this content in a scalable manner, you realize that none of them are actually up to par, especially for AI experiments, right? So you might have a content repository that spans all this content format, but when you try to get that content to refer to as part of the input that you're sharing for OpenAI or Anthropic or whichever model you're using, you realize the struggles really, really fast. So what we realized and what turned out or worked out really, really well for us was we converted all of the content that we have to text wherever possible. And when I say text, in some cases it's .pdfs, in some cases it's a .jsonl format, which works really well with LLMs. And we uploaded all of them into a vector store. And I'm not an engineer, so when I heard vector store first, I was like, I was starting to give up hope. But then what worked out really well was that OpenAI has a built-in vector database. So what that means realistically is that you just upload these files much like you would to a Google Drive or a Dropbox, and OpenAI takes care of all the magic where it is able to extract chunks of relevant information based on the prompt that you're passing to OpenAI and form really, really meaningful responses based on the questions you're asking the model, right? So you can either manually do this uploading to your OpenAI platform, which is actually surprisingly easy to get started with and not really costly to start experimenting with, because you just get to sign up, verify your organization, and you can get started with as little as $5 to $10. By the time we exhausted the $5, we'd seen enough magic happen for us to start investing more and more. If you have a massive amount of context that you want to store in one place and use as references in your AI experiments, I would say OpenAI is a really, really great place to do that. You also have Claude, Anthropic, their API platform. My experience with Anthropic has been that it's very hard to retrieve the files that you've uploaded there, and the actual uploading process itself is, but when I experimented with it, it was only programmatic. You couldn't do it from the UI. So we kind of steered more towards OpenAI. But once you understand the programmatic way of implementing it, both platforms work really well. But OpenAI is the beginner-friendly, quicker way of doing it. What's really important is that you anonymize a lot of the data that you're going to upload, because you might have a lot of call conversations where certain information that you don't really want to upload to OpenAI. So you might need some engineer's help for the anonymization process, which is not really all too hard, and also depends on the type of content you're using. But very important to remember that before you upload this, if you have sensitive content, you anonymize it. And most of your company's internal competitive decks talking points are typically good to go without that caveat, right? So translate all your product knowledge, all the expertise in-house, store it in a vector database, because it's really, really easy to retrieve from there for your AI experiments. And so we've looked at the data that you have, enriching the data, and also knowledge that your team has created, the expertise that your team has created, and how to process all of that, right? Now, once you're done with all of this, is where the smaller details, which actually contribute to really, really meaningful outputs, tend to get looked over, right? Like I mentioned earlier, you have initial enrichment being done by like a Breeze on HubSpot, and then you have your own company's knowledge and data. But what you also need for AI experiments to work really well is the real-time events, right? Like the hiring, like the funding rounds, leadership changes, job openings. There are different products that do this really well, right? User gems, a lot of different products that do this in silos. But I think this is where a product like Clay really, really helps you bring all of this together in a scalable, really, really easy to implement, execute, and maintain manner. But we ensure that we track job changes, recent hires, funding news about the company. We scrape our own website using Clay to keep listening to case studies that have been published to notify the sales team to say in our intelligence operating system, hey, these are all the companies that have case studies, these are all the ones that have testimonials, and so on. So there's a lot that you get to do here. And I think it'd be really interesting to see, what Patrick has to show us, in how to leverage Clay in areas like these.
Yeah, so I think in the last couple minutes or in the last 10 minutes, then we'll do a little bit of kind of show and tell so you all can take some of these detailed steps that we've walked through and actually see how you can put them in play. So Patrick, Char, why don't you stop sharing your screen, and then Patrick, if you can pull your screen up and maybe give us a peek at a Clay table or a couple of Clay tables, talk through problem, use case, and then what something like this can allow you to do as an operator. And then Char, after that, we'll take a look at the go-to-market copilot that you have too.
You guys can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Incredible. Okay. So the table I built here was supposed to be a reductive baseline version of building an effective enrichment Clay table and then making it easy for team members to use. So the problem this solves is, of course, finding more accurate data on prospects that you're planning on reaching out to, but also in a way that makes it easy for sales team members to interact with. One of the major problems we realized recently in building Clay systems is that while maybe a RevOps leader is really easily able to navigate this table and understand all the different integrations, it becomes a lot more difficult when you have like 100 SDRs and you have to train them all on how to create a new row in Clay and then send that data to Salesforce. And it just didn't feel like a very actionable thing. So first, I'll just walk through the table itself. It does some pretty basic enrichment in Clay, some of it a little more recent and some of it just high level. So we have essentially a LinkedIn profile, and you'll see where this LinkedIn profile is coming from in just a second. But we enrich them for all their basic LinkedIn data. So you can see that we have all their experience and all their followers and where they're located. We then enrich the company for the same type of data. So their domain, their employee count, all of the data on their company's LinkedIn. We output their locality, how many employees they have, a company description. We then use a waterfall in Clay to find their total funding and then their investors. Then we also looked for recent news and then had a ChatGPT integration summarize that news into a bulleted list of things that have recently happened with the company. And we have some open jobs and then some value prop ideas. So ways in which my company, The Kiln, could help this prospect company, in which case it's just Clay. So again, there's a lot of information being found here and a lot going on, but how do you actually create a way to make that easier? So we have this tool that I built really quickly in Lovable, and you'll see it's super basic. We call it the Kiln's super proprietary top secrets research tool. And all you do is you throw in a LinkedIn profile URL. Once you throw this in, the profile goes into this Clay table, and you can see the webhooks were received in a few cases here. And then the entire enrichment flow comes through, does all the enrichment data, and then it comes back in a super formatted and like well-structured way back into this software that we built. And this entire thing end to end probably took me like an hour, 2.5 to build ish. And it's because it's just a combination of a bunch of enrichment columns and then prompting Lovable to be able to take API calls and webhooks. All of this is actually very simple to do now. Like Lovable, for those who don't know what it is, it's just a way to prompt an AI to create software for you in plain English. I have no technical experience, but the ability to build these things I think is super powerful. I thought it was a good alternative to what Shara shared. Shara's thing is like the most incredible, high level, abstractive, complex version of this. But this is something I think anybody could build given a few hours of time.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you're focused on making it like accomplishing the outcomes you want. You can see like Clay gives you a very like spreadsheet-like sort of experience with the different columns and all the integrations and the things that are there. Example, proof point, right? Of, hey, here's what you can do with a couple hours of time using some tools like this. And then Chara, to kind of compare and contrast, why don't you show some of the more kind of complex stuff that you can do as well in the last 5 or 6 minutes that we have here?
Yeah. So I think what Patrick's shown in researching about a company or a contact, I think that's one of the fundamental, really important pieces that went into us being able to build what we built. But like I said, one of the problems we're trying to solve for was getting context in front of our SDRs as quickly as possible. So what we built out internally is a sales operating system, which runs pretty much everything that I need to run in RevenueHero, which is our company. So everything from our SDRs, when they need to reach out to somebody who's part of their target list, all the way from our pipeline reviews, is now built on a combination of OpenAI, Firecrawl, what have you. So I'll take a specific example. So if one of our SDRs were to call Chastity from accurate.com, before they make the phone call, they're able to quickly pull up either a cold call script, or if they're about to email them out, they have a really detailed, hyper relevant email. This is based off of research which is run through Anthropic, where it collects information about the company, the recent news, the CTA that's on the website, what kind of jobs are open, and also what the ICPs of RevenueHero care about in that company, purely based off of publicly available information. So how that works is we load up all the companies that we care about from HubSpot, which is the CRM that we use, into this lovable app. We use the bulk API to get all of that information for the one-time load. And then when we initiate research, we couple the company information that we've enriched through Clay to form a prompt similar to this, right? Now, this is a person level prompt, but we have a similar company level prompt that gets constructed by putting together all the tokens from our CRM, right? Like, based on this context, create 3 email messaging that a RevenueHero SDA can reach. All of these are tokens that are translating to, say, person name, company name, and then which scheduler they use is an enrichment information that's been updated against the contact through Clay. So we just put together all these tokens, which I did through Lovable, by the way. I'm not an engineer, so I just said, hey, when I click this button, make an API call to this endpoint, copy pasted the endpoint from the OpenAI documentation, and said, send all of these placeholders from HubSpot, the data that we stored from HubSpot, to construct a sentence like this, and then added additional information. And it sends out a prompt like this, and the prompt responds back, because we have company research, because it's a really detailed prompt, and all the information that I've stored in my CRM through the processes that we just saw. It responds back with, your enterprise solution path asks, need high volume background checks, which is actual copy on their website, on their demo form, which is hyper relevant to RevenueHero because we automate inbound scheduling. And when our SDRs are able to talk with this level of specificity, it feels like they understand the actual pains that Chastity is going through at accurate.com, and actually provides a solution. Emails and cold calls that we felt would work. We didn't rely on AI to create the expertise. We used AI to scale the expertise, right? What I mean by that is AI is never going to write a really, really good email or a really, really good cold call script. What we had to do was show it what a really good email was and what a really good cold call script was from the experts who've been there, done that, and have distilled that knowledge into a written piece, right? This was a combination of our own SDRs, best performing scripts and emails, and the knowledge out there, which we put together in a file, kind of broke down into a structure to say, hey, follow this opener, follow this follow up, and write emails like these. What AI is really good at in experiments like these is scaling that expertise. If you try to create an awesome SDR just using AI, we tried it, it didn't work, and I don't see it working for a lot of others as well. So yeah, that's the operating system that we rely on, and we do a lot of other cool things like automating our marketing roadmap, etc. But I won't brag too much.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. I think both of the examples that you guys shared are tremendous in terms of, they show the ability of what you can do quickly and what you ultimately will need to do in order to get something more sophisticated. And so I think, like, number one, don't believe the LinkedIn hype that people are able to just wave a magic wand and get to the outcomes that we're looking at here on the screen from Chara, for example. He mentioned the hundreds of hours that they had to invest in order to accomplish something like this, but it's, pretty incredible what you're able to do when you can do that. So, keep in mind things like the vector store, the anonymization of data, the last known good repository, like those are all great things you need to do. Also, not things that you necessarily need to go out and do like all at once from the very beginning, right? Like, you're only going to get these things done one thing at a time. So go out, start chipping away at them, move in this direction, and you'll be rewarded for it. So we are at time, actually a minute over. I want to let everybody run. Big thanks to Chara and Patrick for dropping some knowledge, sharing some examples today. And then to all of our attendees out there, when you leave, you will be prompted with a 2-question survey from Zoom to let us know what you thought of the session today. Please provide some feedback, because we have humans and AI that review all of the responses that we get, and that is how we improve our future sessions. Thank you very much to Chara, Patrick, and all of our attendees for joining and dropping some knowledge. I will see you all at the next one. Peace, everybody.